Welcome to The Check-In, a podcast by the Telos group on the Telos channel. The Check-In is a semi-regular conversation where we deep dive into the headlines from Israel, Palestine, and across the world, where we wade into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our community, and our world. This is your host, David Cadwat, checking in from Washington, D.C. We have a small but stellar team with us today. We have Ellie. Where are you checking in from?
Hey, I am currently checking in from Tel Aviv.
Sarah, where are you checking in from?
Checking in from Washington, D.C.
And Greg, where are you checking in from?
I'm in London, England.
Well, we are here today to offer an update from the ground and a reminder of what we are advocating towards. And we're also here to answer a few questions that we often get, like, what comes after a ceasefire? So, folks, stay with us through this whole episode. It is an important update and conversation that you don't want to miss. And as one you hopefully will share in your community. I know many of you are advocating and sharing and getting lots of questions. So please keep amplifying this message of peacemaking, this message of a third way, of human rights for all in your communities. And together we can make a difference. So to get started here, would love just an update from the team. We're about 40 days out now from October 7th timestamping this conversation here today. What are things like on the ground in Gaza, Greg?
None of us are in Gaza, but the pictures and the reports that we're getting out are horrific. We can't confirm the numbers of people killed, but we know it's upwards of 11,000. We don't know the numbers of housing units destroyed. I've seen estimates well over 50% destroyed or damaged, some less. But we do know that 1.5 million people, Palestinians, most of whom were already refugees, are displaced again. They're in the south. They're sleeping on concrete. They're running out of water. They're running out of food. And so much of the world that they knew is gone, disintegrated. So there's nothing for them to really return to at this moment. Even if this stops today, the damage that was done in October 7th in Israel, but the damage that has been done over the last 40 days in Gaza is immeasurable. It's going to take many, many years to recover. And these people are living on the brink, having gone weeks without a sense of safety, security, and option for any stability in their lives. If there is hell on earth, I hate to say it, it is Gaza right now.
Thanks for that important and sobering update, Greg. Ellie, can you update us? What's the current status for the more than about 200 Israelis who are still being held hostage by Hamas? What do we know about their whereabouts? What's the current climate within Israel with the families of these hostages and what they're advocating for?
So what's happening with the hostages? We're, like we said, 40 days into this, and it seems like there's not too much updates in terms of what's happening. So far, 5 hostages have returned. 4 were released by Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, who've held them, and 1 was rescued by the Israeli military. But what we are seeing is growing calls within Israel to release the hostages, for calling on the government to make the hostage release the priority, and to understand what the goal of this war is and how the release of the hostages plays into that. Right now, as we're speaking, there's a march by the families of the hostages, which started yesterday in Tel Aviv, and they're marching to Jerusalem. They should get there by Saturday, and they're calling on Israeli citizens, from all walks of life to join them, and to demand that the government does do whatever is in their power and accept a deal or broker a deal to release the hostages. Right now, it does not seem like the government is pursuing that, but the pressure is increasing. And personally, I really hope that happens. Currently, there's, according to the numbers, 240 people held in Gaza. We don't know how many of them are alive. We don't know their situation. And the stories coming from the families are absolutely devastating. So that's the current situation.
Ellie, also, I know there's a former partner of Telos tragically learned that she had actually been killed on October 7th. I did not know her personally that well, but she lived in one of the kibbutz close to the Gaza border and was a famed peace activist, one of the founders of Beit Salem and founder of Women Wage Peace, which is an Israeli organization that mobilized tens of thousands of Israeli and Palestinian women to march for peace and often didn't get any press in the international press. Vivian Silver, who was a true hero, actually was killed on October 7th, and would presume she had been held hostage. And so just yet another horrific story from the ground.
That's right. So Vivian Silver, as you're saying, was a well-known peace activist, and I did not know her personally, but a lot of my network is connected to her, and her funeral will be held tomorrow morning. She was from Kibbutz Be'eri, and it's just the tragic loss that we are also continuing to experience, still reverberating from October 7th. And in a large part within the pro-peace community here in Israel.
And Ellie, also one thing, I think our listeners may not fully appreciate is the number of Palestinians being held in Israeli jails, and many of them are in fact detained without charge. So, and many of them are also children, hundreds of children in Israeli jails, correct?
Yeah. So since the beginning of this war, we've seen a huge crackdown, and by the Israeli police and Israeli military, and then a massive increase of Palestinian detainees in Israeli prisons, including thousands of Gazans who are within Israel as laborers, as workers with a permit, who've been held without charge, and hundreds and thousands of Palestinians from across the West Bank and also from within Israel, who are held for social media posts or likes or things like that, and others that we don't know, what charges they're even facing, if any. Just today I saw there was a video of Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the national security minister, who's in charge of the police, who visited one of these Israeli prisons where political prisoners are being held, and boasted about the tough situation that these prisoners, these people are in, that they have, are in confinement and solitary confinement and all these things. And I think what we're seeing is just this escalating of violence, and just I don't see where this is going to lead to.
Sarah, I understand a lot is happening in the West Bank now as well.
Yeah, I think while the world has been focusing on what's happening in Gaza and Israel as it needs to and as it should, the news coming out of the West Bank hasn't been making headlines the way it would have otherwise if this wasn't happening. And it's super important to understand what's happening there too, because it's all connected. What happens in any of these areas is not separate from the entire context and situation. So since October 7th, Palestinians across the West Bank have been experiencing crippling lockdowns. Freedom of movement has been almost entirely restricted, so folks can't leave their towns or their areas where they're from to move to other areas or cities, or even access their farmland. There's been widespread raids in different communities that have caused turmoil, terrorized Palestinians. We've discussed in other places how night raids, right, terrify children and really create an atmosphere of fear in communities. And there have been unacceptably high numbers of civilian casualties, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But one of the other things that's happened too is that right now is the olive harvest season, which is integral to Palestinian financial stability and the economy beyond just this season. And so what we're seeing now will reverberate in families and communities for months and potential years to come. Since October 7th, over 850 Palestinians have been forced out of their homes due to settler violence. According to B'Tselem, as of November 12th, 16 entire communities no longer exist. These are villages and places that have been under threat by settlers for a long time. And now, under the cover of the bigger things that are happening and the lack of headlines and news attention, the settlers have succeeded in driving out the families and communities, and they probably won't get to come back. This is part of the ongoing Nakba for Palestinians, and something we've discussed on this podcast and elsewhere as a continued ongoing problem that's just heightened in this moment. In addition to that displacement, Israeli forces and settlers have killed more than 178 Palestinians across the West Bank and injured over 2,000 more. This has been done with impunity. And I think it's really important to emphasize this isn't just rogue settler violence. This displacement and direct attacking of Palestinians across the West Bank, Israel as a state isn't just turning a blind eye to it, they are enabling it and encouraging it. And as we know, there's no system accountability for the violence enacted against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. And so this is another thing that we can't tune away from, right? It's got to tie into our advocacy around Gaza and bringing back hostages. We can't ignore what's happening in the West Bank because it is so directly tied to this situation and system that we know isn't peaceful and wasn't peaceful and is integral to the ongoing work to bring peace and justice for Israelis and Palestinians.
Thanks for that update, Sarah, and I appreciate your last point too, in that everything that you're sharing, everything that we're naming here, none of it is making any of us safer. None of it is making Israelis safer. None of it's making Palestinians more free or dignified or secure either. And so we have to stop the badness. What we're seeing now is an investment in the very same strategies that brought us here, right? This is how we got here. It's not how we get out. So what can we do in this moment, especially for those of us who are listening, who are in the United States, who live in a representative democracy, who live in a country that has immense power and wealth and privilege? What opportunities do we have to be a part of the work of stopping this violence and transforming it into a situation, a context where both Israelis and Palestinians can flourish? Because that is our goal, right? This vision of mutual flourishing, where Israelis have what they need to flourish and Palestinians have what they need to flourish at the same time. We believe that that's possible. So what can we do in this moment to push towards that future?
I would say first and foremost, before anything else, we have to demand a ceasefire. We have to stop the fighting, stop the deaths, stop the killing that are happening now. And that is a call that can be made in the United States by every American citizen to their representatives, to their communities. The United States is actively a part of this war, resupplying the Israeli military and supporting Israel diplomatically and otherwise. So the power that American citizens have to change the course of what's happening on the ground is immense. So I would say first and foremost, we have to have a ceasefire. We have to call for a ceasefire right now. And that needs to include as well the return of the hostages held by Hamas. And from there, we need to push for a more long-lasting solution that, as we believe and as you said, recognizes the right of all people in the land to flourish and to live with safety and security.
I'd also love to encourage people who are hearing in their communities like, oh, Israel, Palestine, it's so complicated. I can't decide. I don't know anything about it. I want to encourage you that a call for ceasefire is not about making determination between who's right, who's wrong. I would love for you to see what I see and what everybody on this call knows and to feel compelled to act regarding sort of this moral rationale for a ceasefire in this particular moment. And yet, what you need to know is that this is not happening half a world away. Our government, President Biden, didn't just support Israel, he owned the Israeli response, which the entire world sees as not just disproportionate, but counterproductive not just to Palestinian life, but to Israeli security. And beyond that, what we're seeing is this is having regional and global impact. What I mean by that is that I'm not sure that most Americans understand our lives as Americans, not as Palestinian, Jewish, Israeli, whatever, Arab Americans. Our life as Americans will be different going forward because of what's happening today. If it stops today, the world is going to be a very different place. America's role in the world is very different. We're going to see a lot of proxy wars and all sorts of tensions rise up in other parts of the world. It may not and will likely not be as safe for Americans to travel as it once was. We are seeing polarization in America, which had already reached a fever pitch, increase exponentially, along with these horrific brands of anti-Semitism, anti-Palestinianism, which is something that is not named but is also pernicious, and Islamophobia. What I'm getting at here very simply is that calling for ceasefire is not calling for an end. It's not taking a side between Israelis and Palestinians. What it is saying is, wait, let's stop. Let's not step into this trap. Let's not make mistakes exponentially worse than our response to 9/11, which took months to formulate, not hours. Right? So calling for a ceasefire is in everyone's interest now, so we can actually hold people accountable, hold war criminals accountable from October 7th, ensure that these ideologies that seek to destroy entire peoples are actually dealt with, not in a rhetorical fashion with bombs. You don't bomb your way to peace. Hamas is still going to exist. These ideologies will exist, just as the ideologies of the right in the Israeli government are going to exist as well. What we need to do is we need to prevent this from becoming a regional or a global conflict, which it's at risk of becoming right now. So I encourage everyone listening, even if you think, or your friends think, I'm not involved, actually we are. We affect what's happening on the ground. We owned it, and we are going to pay the consequences. Hopefully, we can stop it soon, and calls for ceasefire are having an effect, but hopefully we can stop this soon and move to this next phase and ensure that the consequences that the world faces are much less than cataclysmic, which this will be if this is allowed to get out of control.
I think that's so important, Greg, what you just named, that this is in everyone's interest and that we are owning this. I think for a long time, the U.S., especially American Christian communities, have been owning this and the realities on the ground. And that's something that my invitation to you, a listener, and to your community is to one, don't stop advocating right now in this moment. This is very urgent, but also do your homework. Learn about this history. Why are we so deeply embedded? How does Christian theology and practices of the church, how does that shape the way that the U.S. engages and shape the realities of life, everyday life for Palestinians and Israelis? There are a number of resources that you can engage that we've put together, that we've recommended, including a really comprehensive but accessible kind of frequently asked questions document on our website called Evangelicals in Israel, Palestine, that walks through the history of why does this community, the community that I come from, that I identify with, why do we care so much about this issue? Where does that come from a theological perspective? What's the history here? And how does it shape into policies, lobbying, pilgrimage, even on the ground, that really does make a huge impact for people's everyday lives? So not only do the advocacy that's so necessary in this moment, but also educate yourself, do your homework. It's really essential.
DCAT, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because particularly for our listeners, this is something that we can do in this particular moment that will have impact, and that's necessary. What do I mean by that? People of faith around the Holy Land tend to be some of the greatest obstacles. We see some segments of the Jewish community right now who believe we're in messianic times and the Messiah is going to come for the first time. We see ads on television about the rapture, the second coming of Jesus, and some Christians, not all, around the world getting excited about the potential end of the world. In Islam, there's this idea of the Mahdi, and some segments of Muslims around the world are really motivated right now, believing we're entering again the end times in which Jesus will return. This is so dangerous and so so problematic. It's time for people of faith to stand up and reclaim their faith, to say, not in our name, this is wrong, but there's another way, to show us what the faith is really about. So many of these faiths, of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have different expressions which have been silent and which are sitting on the sidelines right now. If folks of faith can't get up right now and say, look, what's happening in the Holy Land right now, the so-called Holy Land, is totally unholy, and there's a different way out. It's not a question of whether religion is involved, but how. So it's a time now to call out and call in. And in fact, if we look at history, if we look at South Africa's apartheid, there was a theology of apartheid before there were apartheid laws. So this was something that was religiously based. But the movement against apartheid also started in faith communities as well. Same with civil rights in the States. So this is something a lot of listeners to this podcast can actually do. Your friends, your family, your houses of worship, show what it really means to be somebody who believes in a faith in which everyone is created equal, and we're going to fight for that.
That's an important message, Greg. That there is another way, and those of us who identify as people of faith can champion that. That's an expression that's true within our communities that's being sidelined, and we have to actually use our voice now more than ever. I want to come back to something you said earlier, Greg, about ceasefire being in everyone's interest. Tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, what comes after a ceasefire. If we're able to get to a ceasefire, hostilities stop, hostages are able to be released, what's next, right? Because for a lot of folks, that begs the question, is that going to be accountability for Hamas's actions? Is Israel going to be safe and secure? So if we know that ceasefire is the first step, but it's not the only step. It's not the way, it's not in and of itself lasting in just peace. So what needs to come after a ceasefire?
DCAT, ceasefire, again, is the next step, and it's the first step. And there are many steps after this. The problem with talking about the day after is we don't know when that's going to be. We're at such a risk of being drawn into a regional and actual global conflict right now. This is what the Middle East has always been about. It's been about a nexus of these proxy wars over the last 150 years or so right now. And so ceasefire helps to prevent this from becoming not just catastrophic, but cataclysmic. The day after Gaza, if we stopped today, which we won't, is a horrendous reality on the ground, because you have 3/4 of the population in what many are calling a continuation of the Nakba that began surrounding Israel's independence in 1948. You have these people displaced, and there's nowhere for most of them to return to. Hospitals, schools, roads, playgrounds, all the infrastructure of life, bakeries, restaurants, houses of worship, most of these things are destroyed along with their homes. So there's going to be a massive rebuilding process. Israelis have a rebuilding process to go through too. And a couple 100,000 Israelis are currently displaced. Most of them do have homes to return to. The questions of accountability are going to come into place. And what's the larger political horizon? That's if this stops today. So how do we hold people accountable for war crimes? Sadly, we've been witnesses to horrific war crimes, but starting on October 7th, many before that, but an exponentially greater number since. And so we're going to have to hold people accountable. That obviously includes Hamas. No matter what anyone will tell you about resistance and whatnot, there's a clear prohibition under international law against targeting civilians, period. Full stop. That is illegal. It's not just illegal, it's a certain kind of illegal. There's a jus cogens norm under international law. Big fancy Latin term. It means there's no defense for certain crimes. There's no defense for targeting civilians intentionally. There's no defense for genocide. There's no defense for apartheid. These are crimes that there's no rationale, military rationale under international law for. So the accountability piece is going to be complex and difficult, but it's one that we have to learn how to embark on. How else do we stop this? We don't stop these things from bombing each other into oblivion. Like genocide doesn't rationalize genocide. If it does, we're just going to keep going until the whole world is completely destroyed. There has to be a baseline here. And so there are actual mechanisms in international courts, but I think more importantly, what this will come back to is a political and a diplomatic process. We see Israel engaging in horrific behavior right now which I think it's hard to argue that they are not, in effect, targeting civilians. I mean, the Gaza City is almost destroyed right now after these weeks of bombing, and so it's at least indiscriminate. And so there's going to be a lot of questions of accountability. Israel's capable of engaging in negotiations. So is Hamas. So is Hezbollah. Obviously, we want to look at a time beyond these folks. If we look back at the larger political history, we'll see Hamas on October 6th was not popular among anyone. None of the Palestinian leadership was on October 6th, but 70% of Gazans didn't want Hamas rule, didn't trust Hamas rule. And so there are ways out of this, but the ways to get out of situations like this through complex political processes is not to cage people up for 16 years, like what happened in Gaza. The rise of Hamas was predicted. And in fact, it was encouraged and aided and abetted by the Israeli government that saw an interest. And this is all public record. You should all Google this if you don't trust me. Netanyahu said that Hamas rule in Gaza was a strategic asset for Israel, because it meant that you'd have a divided Palestinian polity, and Israel could go ahead settling the West Bank, as Sarah was discussing earlier, without a lot of pressure from the international community, which was exactly what was happening. And so we need to come back to these fundamentals, fundamental human rights for Palestinians, for Israelis, for Jews, for Christians, for Muslims, for atheists, for whomever you are. Like, if we come back to this human rights baseline and the international community organizes around that, and Israelis and Palestinians, and there are many on the ground. Tragically, one of the great champions, Vivian Silver, for human rights, was murdered in her home on October 7th. There are so many people who've been doing this work and who have a vision of what a shared society could finally look like. These voices need to be amplified, and the international community has to stop giving us all of this hypocritical rhetoric about centering human rights and mourning the loss of all civilians, and actually back this up with their policies instead of aiding and abetting these horrific circumstances that lead us nowhere but oblivion.
This moment is urgent, folks. I mean, we know we've been saying this for a number of weeks, but we are heading towards something even more horrific. And yet we have voice and agency to be a part of stopping it, to be a part of ending the bloodshed so we can find a path towards an actual solution for all people in the region to flourish. Before we close, any last thoughts? Sarah, do you want to jump in here?
Another thing we can do, and that's so important in this moment, is to continue raising our voices, especially for those who've been silenced. As Ellie mentioned, we are implicated as Americans, but the flip side of implication is opportunity. Because we are involved, if we keep raising our voices and advocating for the kind of engagement and future we want to see on behalf of our Israeli and Palestinian partners, we have the power and potential to shift how the U.S. engages. And so especially as, Palestinian partners in Israel and across the West Bank and Israeli partners across Israel are being silenced, are being actively threatened for speaking out on behalf of human rights and even just solidarity with those who are mourning, we need to fill that void, not speaking for folks, but amplifying their messages and lending our own voices within our communities where we have access and power. And so this is not the time to turn back and stay silent. This isn't the time to lose hope. It's the time to really speak up and continue advocating against violence and for the type of future we want to see.
I'd like to just say that it's important to recognize that your voices are having impact. The discourse is changing. More and more people are calling out for a space in which we can hold the dignity of all human life, Israeli and Palestinian, and fight injustice together for a world in which all Israelis and Palestinians can finally flourish. That's something that people want. That's something that people recognize. But to get there, we have to continue to raise our voices against the government leaders and against folks in our faith traditions and in our community who are trying to turn us against each other. There's real opportunity here. The world will never know justice. We'll never know a place in which we can all flourish unless more of us stand up and say, hey, wait, this is wrong. We're not going to let this happen. Not in our name. And hey, wait, guess what? There's a really incredible version of our humanity that can exist. It's not going to erase the horrors that we're seeing today. Nothing can. I don't want to tell some Pollyanna-ish story about some good coming from what we're seeing in Gaza today. There is none. This is something that will be commemorated for generations, and hopefully it stops today. But it is to say we are condemning ourselves to repeat these things until and unless we do something. And we actually have opportunity. Those of us listening to today, those of us speaking, our voices are having impact. It may not feel like this. So please follow my brilliant colleague Sarah's advice to pace yourself for the ultra marathon, to nourish yourself and your families as we are able, so that we can carry this work forward. But also, don't only despair. Yes, despair when you see horrors like we're seeing today, but don't only despair, recognizing that we have been placed in this world, in this position, with our convictions, with our hearts breaking for multiple people at the same time, with our recognition of injustice and the possibility of injustice, for a moment like this, where we can rise up and we can say, there is a better way. Now is the time to chart that vision. Now is the time to work for it. Now is the time to come back to Mitri Rahib's immortal words from Bethlehem: hope is what you do. So today, do hope. Make a better world for all of us and each other.
Thanks, Greg, for that powerful word. I think we should close at that. Folks, you can find ways to engage in our show notes, including a link to our script to use when calling your elected officials, petitions to sign, ways to continue learning and leaning in and use your voice in this moment. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.
I wanna be by your side. I wanna light up your life. I wanna be your accomplice. Lead me now. You say, come close, come close, come close. You say, come close, come close, come close. Listen, follow my lead. Walk next to me. Listen, follow my lead. Walk next to me. I wanna know what to say. I wanna know what to do. I wanna be your accomplice. Lead me now. You say, come close, come close, come close. You say, come close, come close, come close. You say, come close, come close, come close. Come close, come close, come close. Listen, follow my lead. Walk next to me. Listen, follow my lead. Walk next to me. Walk next to me. Walk next to me. Walk next to me. Listen, follow my lead. Walk next to me. Listen, follow my lead. Walk next to me. Caminando, caminando, caminándolo conmigo. Caminando, caminando, caminándolo conmigo. Cuando caminas conmigo, ligero se hace el camino. Cuando yo te siento cerca, sé que mi vida florezca. Caminando, caminando, caminándolo conmigo. Listen, follow my lead. Walk next to me. Listen, follow my lead. Walk next to me. Caminando, caminando, caminándolo conmigo. Caminando, caminando, caminándolo me.